Montana Territory, 1878. Winter descended on the frontier with merciless fury, burying the rugged landscape beneath 4 feet of snow and crushing the spirits of even the hardiest settlers. Yet it was in this unforgiving white expanse that Dillon Sutherland believed he belonged. Alone, the way he'd learned was safest. The 25-year-old cowboy squinted against the late afternoon sun, reflecting off the endless white as he guided his mare through the narrow pass. His breath formed clouds before his chiseled face, the cold biting at his high cheekbones and strong jaw. Beneath his worn leather coat and wool layers, his lean, muscular frame remained tense, always vigilant, always ready. 3 years working cattle in Montana's unforgiving wilderness had taught him the steep price of letting down his guard. "People bring nothing but trouble out here, Belle," he murmured to his mare, his only companion these past years. "The frontier's no place for trusting hearts." He'd seen what happened to those who believed otherwise: families decimated by disease, men betrayed by partners, women widowed by violence. The Blackfoot raid that had taken his employer's wife 2 summers ago had only confirmed what Dillon already knew. Attachment was a luxury no frontiersman could afford. Better to drift between ranches, taking work where he could find it, avoiding the entanglements that inevitably led to heartbreak. Yet despite his determination to remain unmoored, something had drawn him back to this particular valley for the 3rd winter in a row, something beyond the generous pay offered by the Jackson cattle operation. Perhaps it was the majestic mountains that surrounded the ranch like silent guardians, or the way the stars hung so close on clear nights he felt he could reach up and touch them. Whatever it was, he'd signed on again, telling himself it was merely convenient winter work while ignoring the dangerous feeling of familiarity that had begun to creep into his bones. He was still several miles from the ranch when he noticed the thin column of smoke rising from a copse of pines to the east, not where any cabin should be. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. Smoke meant people, and unexpected people usually meant trouble. Dillon pulled his hat lower and turned Belle toward the disturbance, every sense alert as they approached. The distant sound of frantic movement caught his attention, followed by what might have been a woman's voice. His jaw tightened. Women were rare in these parts, and unprotected women rarer still. The scene that greeted him as he broke through the trees confirmed his suspicions. A small wagon lay tilted precariously on its side, one wheel completely shattered. Nearby, a young woman fought to control a panicked horse that threatened to bolt with what remained of her supplies. "Easy now," Dillon called, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Let me help before you lose him entirely." The woman turned, and Dillon felt an unexpected jolt. She couldn't have been more than 20, with golden hair escaping a practical bonnet and cheeks flushed from exertion against her fair skin. Her blue calico dress, clearly chosen for durability rather than fashion, was partially covered by a heavy wool coat that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that caught him, bright blue and filled with a fierce determination that seemed at odds with her precarious situation. "I've got him," she insisted, though the horse nearly pulled her off her feet as she spoke. Without waiting for permission, Dillon stepped forward and took the reins, speaking low and steady to the frightened animal until it finally calmed. Only then did he turn back to the woman. "You're a long way from anywhere, miss." "Traveling alone." The woman squared her shoulders, a mixture of pride and wariness in her stance. "I'm Gracie Bellingham. I was headed to my brother's homestead near Elkhorn Creek when my wagon wheel gave out." "Elkhorn's nearly 20 miles north of here," Dillon said, frowning as he glanced at the darkening sky. "You'll never make it before nightfall, especially not with a broken wheel and this weather coming in." "I'm well aware of the difficulty, Mr. Sutherland." "Dillon Sutherland." "Well, Mr. Sutherland, I appreciate your concern, but I've managed difficult situations before." As if to contradict her words, the wind picked up, bringing with it the first flurries of what promised to be yet another brutal storm. Dillon sized up the situation quickly. The wagon couldn't be repaired here, and night was falling fast. The temperature would drop below 0 before midnight. No one, not even this stubbornly independent woman, could survive that without proper shelter. "Miss Bellingham, I work at the Jackson Ranch about 5 miles south of here. It's your nearest option for shelter tonight." He gestured to the darkening sky. "That storm's going to bury this valley by morning." She hesitated, glancing from her damaged wagon to the threatening clouds. clearly calculating her limited options. "I can't just leave my things," she finally said. "Everything I own is in that wagon." "We'll secure what we can and come back for the rest tomorrow," Dillon replied, already moving to untether her horse from the broken wagon. "But right now we need to move, unless you'd prefer freezing to death with your possessions." Gracie's eyes narrowed at his blunt assessment, but a sudden gust of wind seemed to make the decision for her. "Very well, Mr. Sutherland. It seems I have little choice but to accept your assistance." As they worked to gather her most essential belongings, Dillon found himself puzzled by this woman. Most Eastern transplants arrived with husbands or families, ill-prepared for frontier realities. This one moved with purpose, knowing exactly which items to prioritize, tying bundles with efficient knots that spoke of practical experience rather than delicate upbringing. "Your brother sent for you?" Dillon asked as he secured her trunk to Belle's saddle. "No," Gracie replied, something guarded entering her voice. "My circumstances in St. Louis changed. James doesn't know I'm coming." The way she averted her eyes told Dillon there was more to her story, but frontier etiquette dictated he not pry. Everyone out here carried secrets and scars. He nodded and offered her a hand up onto his horse. "You'll ride Belle, I'll lead her on foot." "That hardly seems." "It's not negotiable, Miss Bellingham. The trail gets treacherous ahead and Belle knows it well. I don't trust your horse not to spook again." For a moment she looked ready to argue, but then sighed and accepted his outstretched hand. Her fingers were cold but surprisingly calloused, not the hands of a society woman. As he helped her onto the saddle, a gust of wind nearly knocked them both over, and fat snowflakes began to fall in earnest. "Hold tight," he instructed, taking Belle's reins and leading them both toward the ranch, the second horse following behind with Gracie's hastily salvaged possessions. The storm descended with unexpected ferocity. Within an hour, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a howling blizzard that reduced visibility to mere feet. Dillon kept one hand on Belle's bridle and the other on the lead rope of Gracie's horse, fighting through drifts that sometimes reached his knees. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Gracie called over the wind, her earlier confidence giving way to understandable concern. "I could find the Jackson Ranch blindfolded," Dillon assured her, though in truth, the conditions were becoming dangerously disorienting. He'd seen men die less than 100 yards from their own cabins in storms like this, turned around and frozen before they could find their way home. Another hour passed in grueling silence as they pushed forward. Dillon's legs burned with the effort of breaking trail through the deepening snow, but he refused to rest. Rest meant death in weather like this. Just as he began to fear he'd somehow miss the turn to the ranch, Belle nickered and pulled slightly to the right. "Good girl," he murmured, trusting the horse's instincts. Minutes later, the welcome glow of lamplight appeared through the swirling white, and the shadowy outline of the Jackson Ranch house emerged from the storm. By the time they reached the barn, Dillon's face was numb with cold, and Gracie had gone worryingly quiet. He helped her down from the saddle, alarmed when she stumbled against him, her limbs stiff from cold and the long ride. "Just a little further," he encouraged, supporting her weight as they made their way from the barn to the main house. Mrs. Jackson, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and equally iron resolve, opened the door before they could knock, drawn by the commotion in the yard. "Lord Almighty, Dillon, we'd given you up for lost in this blow, and who's this?" she demanded, stepping aside to let them enter. "Gracie Bellingham," Dillon explained, guiding the half-frozen woman to the fire. "Found her with a broken wagon about 5 miles out. She was trying to reach her brother's place near Elkhorn." "James Bellingham?" Mrs. Jackson asked sharply, already bustling to fetch blankets. Gracie nodded, her teeth chattering too violently for speech. "Well, you picked a fine time to travel, girl. Your brother's place is a 2-day ride in good weather, and we won't see good weather for weeks now." The older woman wrapped a heavy quilt around Gracie's shoulders. "You'll stay here until the trail's clear. No sense risking your life or anyone else's." Dillon expected protest from the independent young woman, but she merely nodded, too exhausted and cold to argue. He should have left then, returned to the bunkhouse where he belonged, but something kept him rooted in place, watching as Mrs. Jackson fussed over Gracie with motherly efficiency. "You'll sleep in the spare room," Mrs. Jackson was saying, "and tomorrow we'll send word to your brother when the boys ride out to check the north herd, assuming this storm breaks by then." Thank you, Gracie finally managed, her blue eyes lifting to find Dillon still standing awkwardly by the door. And thank you, Mr. Sutherland, she hesitated, a flash of vulnerability crossing her face before she composed herself. I misjudged the situation. If you hadn't come along when you did. Anyone would have done the same, he replied stiffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude and even more uncomfortable with the strange tightness in his chest at seeing her huddled by the fire, her golden hair falling loose around her shoulders. Mrs. Jackson snorted. Anyone with sense perhaps, but sense is in short supply on the frontier. You're lucky it was Dillon who found you. Most reliable hand we've ever had, even if he does prefer his own company to civilized folks. Dillon shifted uncomfortably under the dual scrutiny of both women. I should get back to the bunkhouse. Storm's only going to worsen. Mrs. Jackson nodded. Tell the boys to secure everything tight. This one feels like it might last. With a final nod to Gracie, Dillon stepped back into the howling night, cursing the sudden, unwelcome thought that the Jackson ranch suddenly felt more like home than it had any right to. The blizzard raged for 3 days, locking everyone in place. The ranch hands ventured only between bunkhouse and barn, caring for the animals while the drifts piled higher than a man's head in places. On the 4th morning, Dillon woke to blessed silence. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white broken only by the dark shapes of buildings and the distant pine forest. He'd managed to avoid the main house and its unexpected guest since the night of their arrival, but that morning Mr. Jackson assigned him to help clear paths between the buildings. By midday, he found himself reluctantly approaching the kitchen door with an armload of firewood. He hadn't expected to find Gracie there alone, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded bread dough with practiced movements. She looked up at his entrance, a smudge of flour on her cheek and her hair pulled back in a simple braid. Mr. Sutherland, she greeted him. Mrs. Jackson went to check on Mr. Jackson's chest cold. She'll be back shortly. Dillon nodded, depositing the wood in the box beside the stove. He should have left immediately, but instead found himself lingering, watching her confident movements. You seem at home in a kitchen, he observed. A faint smile touched her lips. I worked as a cook's assistant in St. Louis for nearly 2 years. Before that, I helped my mother with everything at home. Something shadowed her expression. She passed last spring. I'm sorry, Dillon said automatically, though the words felt inadequate. Gracie shrugged, the practiced gesture of someone who had learned to carry grief without displaying it. Life continues. We adapt. The simple philosophy delivered without self-pity struck Dillon unexpectedly. It echoed his own approach to survival, though he'd never articulated it so clearly. Your brother doesn't know you're coming, he said, remembering their conversation during the rescue. Won't he be surprised to find you on his doorstep? She pressed the dough into a waiting pan with more force than necessary. James and I haven't spoken in 3 years, not since he left for Montana after our father died. She looked up, challenge in her eyes, but he's the only family I have left and circumstances required a change of scenery. The careful evasion made Dillon wonder what she was running from, but he knew better than to ask. Half the men in the territory had stories they preferred not to tell. The frontier's no place for, he began, then stopped himself. For a woman alone, she finished, arching an eyebrow. Perhaps, but St. Louis proved no safer, Mr. Sutherland, just differently dangerous. Before he could respond, Mrs. Jackson returned, bringing with her a gust of cold air and brisk orders that sent Dillon back outside. But Gracie's words followed him, echoing uncomfortably through his thoughts as he worked. The next week brought clear skies and bitter cold, with temperatures dropping low enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. The ranch hands worked shorter shifts, rotating to prevent frostbite, and spent evenings huddled in the bunkhouse playing cards and swapping increasingly outlandish stories. Dillon participated minimally, his mind frequently drifting to the main house where Gracie had apparently made herself indispensable. According to Pete, the youngest ranch hand who couldn't stop talking about the pretty lady, she had taken over much of the cooking and was helping Mrs. Jackson with the endless mending that winter confinement allowed time for. She can read, too, Pete reported one evening. Been reading to the Jacksons after supper from some book of poetry. Mrs. Jackson says it's the most civilized their home has felt in 20 years. Dillon grunted noncommittally, though the image of Gracie reading by lamplight stirred something unexpected in him, a longing he'd thought long buried after watching his own parents' tragic end. His mother had read to them on winter evenings too, before the fever took her and his father both, leaving 16-year-old Dillon alone to make his way in a world that cared nothing for orphaned boys. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Mr. Jackson announced that conditions had improved enough to send riders to check the northern pastures, and, incidentally, to inform James Bellingham that his sister had arrived in the territory. "Dillon, you'll head that way," Jackson instructed. "You know the trail best, and there might still be drifts high enough to cause trouble." Dillon nodded, ignoring the inexplicable reluctance he felt at the assignment. It made perfect sense. He'd ridden to Elkhorn Creek numerous times and knew which passes would be navigable. Yet the thought of facilitating Gracie's departure sat uneasily in his gut. That evening he found himself approaching the main house, ostensibly to get directions to her brother's exact location. Mrs. Jackson directed him to the small sitting room where he found Gracie alone, mending a shirt by the firelight. She looked up at his entrance, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Mr. Sutherland, I heard you'll be riding to my brother's homestead tomorrow." "Mr. Jackson thinks the trails are passable," he confirmed, standing awkwardly just inside the doorway. "I wanted to ask exactly where his place is located." Of course, she set aside her mending and crossed to a small table where a crude map of the territory lay. James wrote that he settled here, near the fork in Elkhorn Creek. Her finger indicated a spot Dillon recognized, about a day's ride north. "I know it," he nodded, "passed by there last spring while tracking strays." Gracie hesitated, her fingers tracing the map's lines. "What is it like, his place?" The unexpected vulnerability in her question made Dillon choose his words carefully. "It's a solid homestead, small cabin, well-built, good water access, decent grazing land." He remembered the neatly fenced garden plot. "Your brother seems thorough in his work." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face and caught Dillon off guard with its simple beauty. "That sounds like James. He always was methodical." "You haven't seen him in 3 years," Dillon said, the question implicit. Gracie's smile faded. "We disagreed about the direction of our lives after our father died. James wanted to head west immediately, start fresh. I felt obligation to stay, to care for our mother who was already showing signs of consumption." She shook her head, stubborn pride on both sides. By the time she passed, the distance seemed too great to bridge with just a letter. "And now," her blue eyes met his directly, "now I have nowhere else to go." The stark honesty of her admission struck him. Most people on the frontier maintain their pride even in desperate circumstances, constructing elaborate justifications for their situations. Gracie's straightforward acknowledgement of her vulnerability was both disarming and oddly courageous. "I'll deliver your message," Dillon said, suddenly eager to escape the confusing emotions her presence evoked. "Your brother will likely come for you as soon as weather permits." "Mr. Sutherland," she called as he turned to leave. "Please don't tell James about finding me stranded. He always believed I was too impractical for frontier life. I'd prefer not to prove him right with my first independent action in the territory." Dillon nodded, understanding all too well the importance of pride when it was sometimes all one had left. "As far as your brother will know, you arrived safely at the Jackson Ranch ahead of the storm." "Thank you," she returned to her mending, but not before Dillon caught the flash of something like disappointment cross her features, as though she'd hoped for more from their conversation. He rode out at dawn the next morning, following the route north along the frozen creek bed that offered the most direct path to Elkhorn. The weather held clear but bitterly cold, the sun providing light but little warmth as it reflected blindingly off the snow-covered landscape. Dillon tried to focus on the journey, alert for any signs of trouble, but his thoughts kept returning to Gracie. Her situation nagged at him, a young woman alone, fleeing some unspoken trouble in St. Louis, placing her hopes on a reunion with a brother who might or might not welcome her after years of estrangement. The frontier was littered with similar stories, most ending in tragedy. He reached James Bellingham's homestead by late afternoon. The cabin sat in a protected valley, smoke rising steadily from its stone chimney. Fields that would be planted come spring lay dormant beneath the snow, but even in winter, the place showed signs of careful husbandry. A tall man with the same golden hair as Gracie emerged at Dillon's approach, rifle held ready but not threatening, the standard precaution of frontier dwellers. "James Bellingham," Dillon called, keeping his hands visible. "That's right," the man confirmed, lowering his weapon slightly. "What brings Jackson Ranch this far north?" Dillon dismounted, giving his horse a chance to rest as he delivered his news. "I'm Dillon Sutherland. I work for Jackson. I've come with news about your sister." Alarm flashed across Bellingham's features. "Gracie, what about her? Is she—" "She's safe," Dillon assured him quickly. "She arrived at the Jackson Ranch just before the big storm. She's been staying there while the trails were impassable." Bellingham's expression cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, and finally wary relief. "Gracie's here, in Montana Territory. That's impossible. She's in St. Louis with her." He stopped abruptly. "Come inside, it's too cold to talk out here." The cabin's interior was simple but well-ordered, with handcrafted furniture and a few touches, embroidered curtains, a carved chess set that spoke of attention to more than mere survival. Bellingham gestured Dillon to a chair near the fire and poured 2 cups of coffee before sitting opposite him. "Now tell me exactly what my sister is doing 2,000 miles from where she should be," he demanded. Dillon relayed the basic facts, finding Gracie heading toward Elkhorn Creek, the approaching storm, her current residence at the Jackson Ranch, while carefully omitting her broken wagon as promised. Throughout his explanation, Bellingham's expression grew increasingly troubled. "She said nothing about why she left St. Louis?" he asked when Dillon finished. "Only that circumstances required a change," Dillon replied. "She mentioned your mother passed last spring." Bellingham nodded grimly. "I received her letter about that, but Gracie was engaged to be married by then, a businessman named Victor Hammond. The wedding was set for last October." He frowned. "Something must have happened." Dillon kept his expression neutral, though the mention of an engagement stirred an unexpected and unwelcome pang of something he refused to name. "Whatever her reasons," he said instead, "she's at the Jackson Ranch now, waiting for word from you." Bellingham ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so similar to one Dillon had seen Gracie make that the family resemblance was suddenly unmistakable. "I can't leave right now," he said finally. "I've got 60 head of cattle in the north pasture that need daily checking in this cold, and my nearest neighbor who might help is down with pneumonia." He stood and paced the small cabin. "But I can't just leave her waiting either, not after she's come all this way." "The Jacksons don't mind her staying," Dillon offered. "Mrs. Jackson seems to appreciate the help." "That's not the point," Bellingham sighed. 3 years of silence, and now she shows up with no warning. Something's wrong." He turned to Dillon with sudden decision. "I'll write her a letter tonight. Can you take it back with you? Let her know I'll come for her as soon as I can get away, 2 weeks at most." Dillon nodded. "I'll deliver it." "And," Bellingham hesitated, looking uncomfortable, "could you keep an eye on her until then? Gracie's capable, but if she's running from something—" "The Jackson Ranch is safe," Dillon assured him stiffly, uncomfortable with the implied responsibility. "No one there would let harm come to her." Bellingham studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you. You'll stay the night, of course. No sense risking the trail in darkness." Dillon accepted the offer with mixed feelings. On one hand, the hospitality was welcome. Night riding in winter was a fool's gamble. On the other, the unexpected revelations about Gracie's past had left him uneasy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. That night, as he lay on a pallet near Bellingham's fire, Dillon found himself wondering about the engagement Gracie had apparently fled. What had happened to send her fleeing across the country to a brother she hadn't spoken to in years? And why did the thought of her promise to another man bother him so intensely when he'd spent years carefully avoiding entanglements of any kind? The answers eluded him, and by morning he was eager to begin the journey back, telling himself it was merely duty driving him to deliver Bellingham's letter promptly, not any personal interest in seeing Gracie's reaction to her brother's response. The return journey proved more challenging than the outward one. Halfway back to the Jackson Ranch, clouds rolled in, bringing with them a biting wind and sporadic snow that reduced visibility to near nothing at times. Dillon pressed on, knowing the danger of stopping in such conditions, but by late afternoon he was forced to admit he'd lost the trail. "Easy, Belle," he soothed as the horse picked her way uncertainly through deepening snow. "We need to find shelter before this gets worse." As if in answer to his concern, the vague outline of a structure appeared through the swirling white, an old line cabin used by ranchers during summer grazing. Dillon had forgotten it was in this area, but now its weathered walls offered the only hope of survival as night approached and temperatures plummeted. The cabin was little more than a single room with a rusted stove and rough sleeping platform, but it was shelter from the wind and potential salvation if the storm worsened. Dillon settled Belle in the attached lean-to, making sure she had access to the oats he'd packed, then turned his attention to creating enough warmth to survive the night. The ancient stove protested, but eventually accepted the wood he'd scavenged, providing meager heat that barely reached the cabin's corners. Wrapped in every layer he possessed, Dillon huddled near the stove and tried to ignore the howling wind that found every crack in the cabin's aging construction. His thoughts turned inevitably to Gracie, waiting for news of her brother's reaction. Would she be disappointed to receive only a letter instead of James himself? Would she guess that Dillon had revealed more than he'd promised about finding her stranded? The possibilities troubled him more than they should have. Dawn brought little improvement in conditions. The storm had settled into a steady, relentless pattern that promised to last for days. After checking on Belle and finding her reasonably comfortable in the sheltered lean-to, Dillon resigned himself to waiting out nature's fury. By the third day of confinement, his supplies were running dangerously low, and the cabin's temperature barely remained above freezing despite his constant attention to the stove. Outside, the snow had drifted higher than the cabin's windows, and the wind continued its mournful assault on every vulnerable seam in the walls. On the morning of the fourth day, Dillon woke to blessed silence. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of sculpted drifts and crystalline beauty that belied its deadly nature. The sun shone from a perfect blue sky, but the temperature remained brutally cold, the kind of day when unwary travelers froze to death beneath clear skies. Dillon knew he needed to attempt the journey back to the Jackson Ranch despite the hazardous conditions. His food was nearly gone, and the cabin's wood supply wouldn't last another day. More importantly, he couldn't shake the fear that they might send searchers after him, putting more lives at risk if the weather turned again. "What do you say, Belle?" he asked the mare as he saddled her, ready to find our way home. The trail proved nearly impossible to follow, buried beneath 5 feet of new snow in some places. Dillon navigated by landmarks, a distinctive ridge here, a copse of pines there, but progress was agonizingly slow. By midday, he estimated they'd covered less than 5 miles, with at least 10 more to go. It was nearing dusk, the temperature dropping precipitously with the setting sun, when Belle suddenly raised her head and nickered. Moments later, Dillon heard the distant sound of approaching riders. Relief flooded through him as he recognized the shapes of 3 men from the Jackson Ranch. "Sutherland," Pete called as they drew nearer, "we thought you might be frozen solid by now." "Nearly was," Dillon admitted as they reached him. "Got caught in that last blow and had to hole up in the line cabin north of here." Tom, the oldest of the hands, nodded approvingly. "Smart move. We were about to head for Bellingham's place to see if you'd waited it out there." "How'd you know where to look for me?" Dillon asked as they turned toward home, the other men breaking trail to ease Belle's journey. Pete grinned over his shoulder. "Miss Bellingham suggested this route, said it's the one her brother described in his letters as safest in winter." His expression turned teasing. "She's been mighty concerned about your welfare these past days." Dillon felt an unwelcome warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature. "She's just worried about news of her brother," he replied gruffly. "If you say so," Pete laughed, "though Mrs. Jackson says she's been checking the window every hour since the storm broke." The remainder of the journey passed in relative silence, broken only by occasional warnings about hidden drifts or ice patches. By the time they reached the welcoming lights of the ranch, true night had fallen, and Dillon was exhausted beyond measure, his limbs stiff with cold and the lingering strain of his ordeal. They'd barely reached the barn when the door to the main house flew open, spilling golden lamplight across the snow. Gracie stood framed in the doorway, her slender figure wrapped in a heavy shawl as she peered anxiously into the darkness. "They found him," Pete called cheerfully. Stubborn fool was trying to make it back on his own. Dillon dismounted stiffly, his legs nearly buckling as they took his weight. He'd barely steadied himself when Gracie reached him, her face a mixture of relief and something else he couldn't quite name. "You're alive," she said, her voice catching slightly. "We feared when the storm lasted so long." "Found shelter in time," he assured her, oddly touched by her evident concern, "and I have news from your brother." Inside the warmth of the kitchen, Mrs. Jackson fussed over him like a mother hen, insisting he change into dry clothes and sit as close to the stove as possible while she prepared hot food. Only when he'd consumed a bowl of stew and half a loaf of fresh bread did she allow Gracie to approach with questions. "James is well?" she asked, perching on the edge of a chair opposite him. Dillon nodded, reaching into his inner pocket for the letter that had somehow remained dry throughout his journey. "He was surprised to hear you'd come all this way," he said, watching her face carefully as he handed over the folded paper. "Mentioned you were supposed to be married in October." A shadow crossed her features as she accepted the letter. "I see my brother continues to share family matters freely." He was concerned, Dillon said simply. Wanted to understand why his engaged sister suddenly appeared in Montana territory without warning. Gracie's fingers tightened on the unopened letter. "Did you tell him about finding me stranded?" "No. As promised." Some of the tension left her shoulders. "Thank you," she glanced toward the door. "I should read this privately." Dillon nodded, though curiosity burned within him. What had happened in St. Louis? What had driven this capable, proud woman to flee across the country? The questions remained unasked as Gracie slipped from the kitchen, letter clutched tightly in her hand. He didn't see her again that evening. Mrs. Jackson reported that Gracie had retired early, claiming fatigue, though the older woman's knowing look suggested she suspected emotional rather than physical exhaustion was the cause. The next morning, Dillon found Gracie in the barn, brushing down her rescued horse with methodical strokes. She looked up at his approach, her expression carefully composed. "Mr. Sutherland, I'm glad to see you recovered from your ordeal. And I'm curious to know if your brother's letter provided the welcome you hoped for," he replied, leaning against a stall door. A faint smile touched her lips, direct as always. "Yes, James has invited me to stay with him once he's able to retrieve me. He estimates it will be at least 2 weeks before he can leave his cattle." "That's good news, then." "Yes," she resumed, brushing, though the horse was already gleaming. "He also asked a great many questions about my hasty departure from St. Louis and my broken engagement." Dillon waited, saying nothing, knowing that sometimes silence drew confidences more effectively than questions. After several long moments, Gracie sighed and set down the brush. "I suppose you're curious as well. Everyone is. The Jacksons have been too polite to ask directly, but I see the speculation in their eyes." "Your business is your own," Dillon said, though he couldn't deny his interest. "Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "When my presence here results from your intervention, when my brother has apparently enlisted you as my unofficial guardian until he arrives." Dillon frowned. "Your brother merely expressed concern. And asked you to keep an eye on me." "Yes, I can read between the lines of his letter quite well." Her blue eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and something like embarrassment. "I am not a child or an invalid, Mr. Sutherland. I've managed my own affairs for years." "No one suggested otherwise," Dillon replied, surprised by her vehemence. "But the frontier is dangerous for anyone traveling alone, man or woman." "And St. Louis proved equally dangerous in its way." She turned back to her horse, stroking its neck absently. "My fiancé, Victor Hammond, was a respected businessman, owner of several properties, investor in riverboat companies, fixture in social circles. He courted me quite properly, won my mother's approval, and proposed with every appearance of genuine affection." She fell silent for so long that Dillon wondered if she would continue. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a distant quality, as though she were reciting facts about strangers rather than her own experience. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had another family, a woman he had never married and their 3 children, living in a house he maintained across the city. He visited them regularly, provided for them, yet prepared to marry me with no intention of ending that arrangement." Dillon felt a surge of anger on her behalf. He meant to maintain both households. Oh yes. Quite common in certain circles, I learned too late. Her laugh held no humor. When confronted, he saw no contradiction, expected me to accept the situation as the price of financial security and social position. The matter-of-fact recitation couldn't disguise the hurt beneath. Dillon's hands clenched involuntarily at the thought of this unknown man's casual cruelty. You refused, he said, a statement rather than question. I ended the engagement immediately, but Victor, she hesitated. He did not accept rejection gracefully. He threatened to ruin my reputation, to claim I had compromised myself with him and thus ensure no respectable man would have me. In a small community like ours, even false rumors could be devastating. Understanding dawned, so you left before he could act. Gracie nodded. After my mother's death, there was nothing keeping me in St. Louis. I sold what I could, purchased a wagon and supplies, and headed west before Victor realized I was gone. She smiled ruefully, though I clearly underestimated the challenges of winter travel. The simple courage of her actions struck Dillon forcefully. Rather than accept a dishonorable arrangement or allow herself to be trapped by a vengeful man's threats, she had chosen the uncertain dangers of the frontier, had remade her entire life rather than compromise her principles. Your brother will be proud when he knows the full story, Dillon said quietly. Perhaps, she looked uncertain. James always believed I was too impractical, too driven by ideals rather than realities. He may see this as further evidence. There's nothing impractical about refusing to be deceived or threatened, Dillon replied with unexpected heat. The frontier may be harsh, but at least it's honest in its dangers. What your fiancé planned was a different kind of danger, the slow death of dignity and self-respect. Gracie looked at him with surprise as though seeing him properly for the first time. That's exactly it, she said softly. I could face any hardship except living a lie. I just never expected. She gestured vaguely at the barn around them and the snow-covered landscape beyond, to end up stranded in Montana territory. A genuine smile brightened her face. To find understanding in the most unexpected place. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. Dillon felt walls he'd carefully maintained for years wavering in the face of her quiet strength and unflinching honesty. Well, he said gruffly, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts, you're safe now. And your brother will come for you soon enough. Yes, she agreed, though something like disappointment flickered across her features. Thank you for delivering his letter and for keeping your word about the circumstances of my arrival. Dillon nodded and retreated, telling himself the confusing mixture of admiration and protectiveness he felt was merely natural concern for someone who had faced difficult circumstances. Nothing more, but as January gave way to February and the days of waiting for James Bellingham stretched into weeks, Dillon found it increasingly difficult to maintain that fiction. Despite his usual preference for solitude, he discovered reasons to visit the main house with increasing frequency, bringing firewood when they had plenty, checking on repairs that needed no inspection, lingering over meals when invited. Each encounter with Gracie revealed new facets of her character that both intrigued and unsettled him. Her practical skills impressed him. She could mend harnesses as deftly as clothing, bake bread that made the ranch hands almost weep with appreciation, and even assist with basic veterinary care when one of the horses developed a hoof infection. But it was her less tangible qualities that truly began to dismantle his carefully constructed defenses, her unfailing kindness to everyone, regardless of station. The quiet dignity with which she adapted to frontier conditions without complaint, the flashes of dry humor that emerged once she became comfortable with the household, the way she read aloud in the evenings, bringing stories and poetry alive with her expressive voice. And beneath it all, a resilience that matched his own, though born of different hardships. By mid-February, when the expected visit from her brother had still not materialized, Dillon found himself volunteering to make another journey to Elkhorn Creek to check on the situation. Weather's stabilized, he told Mr. Jackson, and Bellingham might need assistance if he's having trouble with his herd. Jackson gave him a knowing look but merely nodded. Take whatever supplies you think necessary. And let Miss Bellingham know your plans. She's been worried about her brother's delay. Dillon found Gracie in the kitchen garden, clearing the last of the snow from beds that would be planted once spring arrived. She looked up at his approach, her cheeks flushed from exertion and cold, a stray lock of golden hair escaping her practical bonnet. "Mr. Sutherland," she greeted him, straightening from her work. "Mrs. Jackson mentioned you might ride north again soon." "Tomorrow, if the weather holds," he confirmed. "Your brother's delay seems unusual." Concern shadowed her features. "I've been worried as well. His letter was so certain about coming within 2 weeks." "I'll find out what's happened," Dillon promised, struck by a sudden, fierce determination to ease her worry, "and bring you word as quickly as possible." "Thank you," she hesitated, then added, "Please be careful." The last journey nearly, she didn't finish the sentence, but her expression conveyed the fear she'd felt during those days when he'd been missing. The realization that she genuinely cared for his safety stirred something deep within Dillon, something he'd thought long buried after watching everyone he'd ever loved taken by disease or violence or the simple, brutal reality of frontier life. "I'll return," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. Her eyes held his for a long moment before she nodded. "See that you do, Mr. Sutherland. The Jackson Ranch would be poorer without you." Only later, as he prepared his gear for the journey, did Dillon allow himself to acknowledge the dangerous truth. Somewhere during these weeks of shared hardship and growing understanding, Gracie Bellingham had become important to him in ways that directly contradicted his long-held belief that attachment was a luxury no frontiersman could afford. The realization should have strengthened his resolve to maintain distance. Instead, it only intensified his determination to ensure her safety and happiness, even if that meant helping her reunite with a brother who would take her away from the Jackson Ranch. Away from him, the journey to Elkhorn Creek proved uneventful compared to his previous attempt. Clear skies and relatively mild temperatures, though still below freezing, allowed steady progress, and Dillon reached James Bellingham's homestead by early afternoon of the second day. His first indication that something was wrong came when no smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. The second was the absence of tracks in the snow surrounding the buildings. When his hail went unanswered, Dillon approached cautiously, one hand near his revolver. The cabin door stood partially open, swinging slightly in the breeze, never a good sign in winter. Inside, Dillon found evidence of hasty departure. Drawers left open, clothing scattered, food abandoned on the table. A thin layer of frost covered everything, suggesting the cabin had been cold for days. More concerning was the overturned chair and dark stain on the floor that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Something violent had happened here, and recently. Dillon searched the outbuildings with growing alarm. The barn contained a single horse, not Bellingham's preferred mount, looking hungry but otherwise healthy. The cattle were nowhere to be seen, though distant tracks suggested they'd been driven north several days earlier. Returning to the cabin, Dillon conducted a more thorough search. In a half-empty drawer, he discovered a crumpled letter that provided the first clue to Bellingham's disappearance. "Bellingham, your cattle or your life. Midnight, Northridge, come alone or the next visit won't end with a warning. C.M." The initials meant nothing to Dillon, but the threat was clear enough. Cattle rustling had increased throughout the territory as winter pressed struggling ranchers to desperation, but this seemed more personal than opportunistic theft. Further searching revealed a second letter, this one apparently begun by Bellingham but never completed or sent. "Gracie, trouble has found me. Cormac Marlowe returned, claims I cheated him in the mining venture 3 years ago. Threatens not just me but you as well, said he'd collect from any family I have. Do not come here, stay at Jackson's where it's safe until." The letter ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. Dillon's blood ran cold at the implications. Bellingham had clearly faced some threat serious enough to abandon his homestead, either fleeing or taken by force, and whoever this Cormac Marlowe was, he now knew about Gracie. Which meant she might be in danger as well. Dillon spent only enough time to feed the abandoned horse and secure the cabin before mounting Bell for the return journey. He pushed hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest his mount, driven by a growing sense of urgency that transcended mere concern. By late afternoon of the following day, he crested the final ridge overlooking the Jackson Ranch and froze at the sight that greeted him. 3 unfamiliar horses stood tied outside the main house, and even from this distance, he could see figures moving with purpose that suggested tension rather than normal activity. Dismounting, Dillon approached cautiously through the cover of pine trees that bordered the ranch's northern edge. As he drew closer, he could make out voices raised in argument, including one that sent a chill through him, Gracie's, tight with controlled fear. He left Belle ground tied in the trees and moved silently toward the bunkhouse, relieved to find Tom cleaning his rifle inside. "What's happening?" Dillon demanded in a low voice, startling the older man. Tom's weathered face darkened. 3 riders came about an hour ago asking for Miss Bellingham, claimed to be friends of her brother, said they had news for her. He spat disgustedly, but something ain't right about them. The leader's got mean eyes, called himself Marlowe. Dillon's worst fears confirmed, he quickly explained what he'd found at Bellingham's homestead. "Jackson and Pete are in the barn," Tom added. "Mrs. Jackson and Miss Bellingham are in the house with those men. They insisted on privacy for their family news." "How many guns between you?" "4 rifles, counting yours, 6 revolvers total, but they're in there with the women, Dillon." "We can't just start shooting." "No," Dillon agreed grimly, "but we need to get Gracie away from them before they decide to leave with or without her cooperation." They formulated a hasty plan. Tom would alert Jackson and Pete, positioning them to cover the front of the house while Dillon attempted to gain access through the kitchen door, hopefully providing enough distraction for the women to escape. The plan dissolved almost immediately when Dillon reached the kitchen window and peered inside. Mrs. Jackson lay unconscious on the floor, a spreading bruise on her temple. Gracie stood backed against the fireplace, facing a tall man whose posture radiated menace. 2 others flanked him, both armed. "Your brother owes me, Miss Bellingham," the tall man was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin glass. "And since he's temporarily indisposed, I've decided you'll serve as collateral until he pays his debt." "My brother would never deal with someone like you," Gracie replied, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. The man, Marlowe, presumably laughed without humor. "You'd be surprised what your precious James was involved in before he decided to play honest rancher. Ask him about Denver sometime, if he survives his current accommodations." "What have you done with him?" The tremor in Gracie's voice betrayed her first real crack in composure. "He's alive for now," Marlowe gestured to his companions. "Get her things, we're leaving." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Gracie stated flatly, her hand moving slightly behind her back. Too late, Dillon realized she was reaching for the fireplace poker. Before he could intervene, she had swung it in a wide arc that caught Marlowe off guard, striking his arm with enough force to make him curse. "You little," his hand connected with her face in a vicious slap that sent her staggering. Dillon didn't remember breaking the window or diving through it, only the cold fury that propelled him across the kitchen, tackling Marlowe before the man could strike Gracie again. They crashed into the table, sending dishes shattering across the floor as Dillon drove his fist into Marlowe's face with all the force he could muster. Dimly, he registered shouting from outside, Tom and the others responding to the commotion, but his focus remained on the man beneath him, the man who had dared to threaten Gracie, the man whose blood now spattered across the kitchen floor as Dillon's fist connected again and again. It wasn't until Gracie's voice penetrated his rage, "Dillon, stop, you'll kill him," that he became aware of hands pulling him backward, away from Marlowe's now unconscious form. The next minutes passed in confusion. Jackson and Pete had subdued Marlowe's companions, who now sat bound in the corner under Tom's watchful eye. Mrs. Jackson had regained consciousness and was being tended by a visibly shaken Gracie, whose cheek bore the angry red imprint of Marlowe's hand. "They said they had news of James," she was explaining to Jackson. "I never suspected until they mentioned details about St. Louis that only someone who'd been asking questions would know." "Your brother's in trouble," Dillon said, flexing his bruised hand. "I found his cabin abandoned, signs of a fight, and letters suggesting this Marlowe holds him somewhere, believing he's owed money from some past venture." Gracie's face paled further. "James was involved in a mining operation near Denver before coming to Montana. He never shared details, but I gathered it ended badly." Her eyes moved to Marlowe's unconscious form. "This man claimed James cheated him." Truth or not, kidnapping and assault aren't legal remedies, Jackson said grimly. We'll take them to the territorial marshal in Helena. Let the law sort it out. And my brother? Gracie asked, voice tight with worry. Jackson looked to Dillon, who understood the unspoken question. Tracking Bellingham would require someone familiar with the territory who could follow cold trails across difficult terrain, someone who wouldn't give up easily. I'll find him, Dillon promised, his eyes meeting Gracie's, once we've secured these men with the marshal. The journey to Helena took 2 days, with Marlowe and his men bound and under constant guard. Upon reaching the territorial capital, the marshal was appropriately horrified by the story and promised to hold the men pending investigation. More importantly, he agreed to send telegrams to neighboring settlements seeking information about James Bellingham or recent cattle rustling that might be connected. Might be weeks before we learn anything useful, the marshal cautioned. Territory's big, communications slow. I'm not waiting weeks to find my brother, Gracie insisted. She had insisted on accompanying them to Helena despite Jackson's concerns about her safety. If these men know where he is. They're not talking, the marshal interrupted, and won't, most likely. Men like that protect their own. Dillon, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. I found tracks leading north from Bellingham's place, cattle driven hard, multiple riders. If they have him, that's where they've gone. North is a mighty big direction, the marshal observed dryly. Could be headed for Canada for all we know. There's limited shelter in that region this time of year, Dillon countered. And they'd need somewhere to hold both cattle and a prisoner. I can think of 3, maybe 4 places that would serve. Gracie turned to him, hope kindling in her eyes. You believe you can find him? I can try, Dillon said simply. But not alone and not with you along. Her expression hardened. If you think I'm returning to the Jackson ranch to sit and wait. I think you're going to get yourself killed if you try to follow me into those mountains, Dillon interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. The thought of Gracie in danger again, possibly worse danger than Marlowe had represented, sent a spike of fear through him that emerged as anger. This isn't a discussion, Gracie. Professional trackers and guns are what's needed, not a woman. She challenged, eyes flashing. My brother's life is at stake. I am not some delicate flower to be protected, Mr. Sutherland. I have come 2,000 miles alone, survived a blizzard, and faced down armed men. I will not be left behind like baggage while you ride off to save the day. The marshal coughed uncomfortably. Perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private, he suggested, gesturing toward the door of his office. Outside in the crisp February air, Dillon struggled to articulate his concerns without revealing the deeper emotions driving them. It's not about you being a woman, he insisted. It's about survival in mountain terrain, tracking through snow, possibly facing armed men who have already proven willing to kill. And you think I can't contribute to any of those efforts? Gracie demanded. That I would be nothing but a burden. I think I can't do what needs to be done if I'm worried about your safety every step of the way. The words escaped before he could moderate them, raw with an emotion he hadn't meant to expose. Gracie's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and something softer. You're worried about me. Dillon looked away, uncomfortable with his own vulnerability. Of course I am. Anyone would be. No, she said quietly, stepping closer until he was forced to meet her gaze. Not anyone, you, Dillon Sutherland, who believes the frontier is no place for attachment. You who keeps everyone at careful distance, her voice softened further. You who came crashing through a window because someone threatened me. The perception in her words stripped away his remaining defenses. I can't lose you, he admitted hoarsely. Not after everything, not when I've just found, whatever this is between us. Gracie's eyes widened at the confession. For a long moment she said nothing, and Dillon feared he'd revealed too much too soon. Then with deliberate care she placed her hand on his arm. Then we help each other, she said simply. We find James together because neither of us could bear to lose the other. Isn't that how it works out here? We face the wilderness together because alone we would perish. The wisdom in her words, the perfect understanding of what frontier life truly required, struck Dillon with the force of revelation. He had spent years believing that attachment was weakness, that caring for others made survival impossible. Yet here was Gracie, offering a different truth, that connection was not vulnerability but strength, that facing dangers together improved the odds rather than diminishing them. "It won't be easy," he warned, even as something like hope unfurled within him. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," she replied with a small smile that transformed her face despite the bruise still visible on her cheek. "But I trust you, Dillon, and I think, perhaps, you're beginning to trust me as well." The marshal proved unexpectedly helpful once the decision was made. He provided recent reports of suspicious activity in the northern regions, including rumors of a new group occupying an abandoned mining camp in the mountains. Better still, he arranged for an experienced scout named Harris to accompany them, along with 2 deputies who could provide additional firepower if needed. They departed the following morning, a small but determined group heading north into increasingly rugged terrain. As they rode, Dillon found himself constantly aware of Gracie's presence beside him. She rode well, adapting to the difficult conditions without complaint, her determination evident in every line of her body. By the 3rd day, they had reached the foothills of the mountain range where Dillon suspected Bellingham might be held. The weather remained mercifully clear, though bitter cold, as they established a base camp from which to scout the abandoned mining operations scattered throughout the region. "There's 3 likely locations within a day's ride," Harris explained that evening as they huddled around the fire. "Old silver mines that played out 5-6 years back. Buildings still standing at most of them, remote enough for privacy, accessible enough to move cattle through if you know the trails. We'll split up," one of the deputies suggested, "cover more ground." Dillon shook his head. "Too risky. If we find them and they outnumber us, we'll need everyone." He didn't voice his other concern, that he refused to let Gracie out of his sight in such dangerous territory. They decided to investigate the closest site first, an old mining camp nestled in a protected valley that had once supported a small but profitable operation. Approaching cautiously the next morning, they discovered recent tracks in the snow, multiple horses and cattle moving through within the past week. "This is it," Dillon murmured, studying the patterns. "At least 6 men based on the different tracks. And they're not trying to hide their presence." "Arrogance," Harris agreed. "They think they're too remote for discovery." They left their horses concealed in a stand of pines and proceeded on foot, moving silently through the trees that surrounded the small collection of buildings below. From their vantage point, they could see 3 cabins, a larger structure that had once served as both office and assay building, and a barn-like structure where equipment would have been stored. Most telling was the column of smoke rising from the largest cabin, and the presence of armed men moving between buildings with the casual confidence of those who felt secure in their isolation. "I count 4 outside," Harris whispered. "Likely more inside." "The cattle?" Gracie asked, scanning the valley. "Probably in that draw behind the main building," Dillon replied. "Natural corral with limited exits." "And James?" "No way to know until we get closer." Dillon turned to the deputies. "We need to observe through a full cycle, day into night, before making any move. See their routines, count their numbers." The deputies nodded, and the group retreated to a more secure position where they could establish a small camp without risk of detection. As darkness fell, they took turns watching the mining camp below, noting the movements of men and the changing of guards. By midnight, Dillon had confirmed his count, 8 men total, rotating watch duties throughout the night. The main cabin appeared to be their center of operations, with at least 3 men inside at all times. If Bellingham was being held, that seemed the most likely location. "We'll need a distraction," he told the others when they gathered to plan at dawn, "something to draw most of them away from the main cabin." "Cattle would do it," Harris suggested. "Start them moving, they'll think someone's rustling their stolen herd." The deputies agreed to create the distraction, while Harris would position himself on the ridge with a rifle to provide covering fire if needed. That left Dillon and Gracie to approach the main cabin and search for Bellingham once the majority of men had been drawn away. "It's too dangerous," Dillon argued when Gracie insisted on accompanying him. "You should stay with Harris." "My brother may be injured," she countered. "He'll need someone he recognizes, someone he trusts, and I won't be helpless." She patted the pocket of her coat where Dillon knew she carried a small derringer, a parting gift from Mrs. Jackson, who had apparently harbored the weapon for years, just in case. Unable to falter logic, Dillon finally acquiesced. They waited until late afternoon when shadows would provide additional cover, then moved into position. The distraction worked better than they could have hoped. When the deputies started the cattle moving with strategic shots and calls, 6 of the 8 men immediately rushed to investigate, leaving only 2 guards at the cabin. Harris's first shot took one guard down cleanly, and the second man ducked for cover, firing blindly toward the ridge. Dillon and Gracie used the confusion to sprint across the open ground to the cabin's back entrance. Inside, they found a crude main room with a table and chairs, a cast-iron stove, and various supplies scattered about, but no immediate sign of Bellingham. "There," Gracie whispered, pointing to a trapdoor in the floor partially concealed by a rug. "Root cellar, maybe." Dillon nodded and moved toward it, gun ready. The heavy wooden door creaked as he lifted it, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. From below came a muffled sound, possibly a voice. "James," Gracie called softly. "James, are you down there?" Another muffled sound, more urgent this time. Dillon motioned for Gracie to stay back as he descended the ladder, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom. The space below was indeed a root cellar, with shelves of preserved goods along one wall and a dirt floor. In the corner, bound to a support post and gagged, sat a man who could only be James Bellingham. His resemblance to Gracie was unmistakable, despite the bruises that marred his face and the several days' growth of beard. His eyes widened in recognition as Dillon quickly cut the ropes that bound him. "Gracie's here?" he asked as soon as the gag was removed, voice hoarse from disuse. "Right above us," Dillon confirmed. "Can you climb?" Bellingham nodded, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. "Been working on these ropes for days. Thought they'd kill me once they had the cattle across the Canadian border." "How many men?" "8 that I've seen, Marlowe's crew from Denver." Bellingham's expression darkened. "He still believes I cheated him out of his share of the mine." "I didn't, but he'll never believe it." "Marlowe's in custody in Helena," Dillon informed him as they moved toward the ladder, along with 2 of his men. "That still leaves." The rest of Bellingham's warning was drowned out by a sudden commotion above, a crash, a cry of pain that Dillon recognized with heart-stopping clarity as Gracie's voice, and then the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Come on up nice and slow," called an unfamiliar voice, "or the girl gets a bullet through that pretty head." Dillon froze, every instinct screaming to rush up the ladder and confront the threat, but the cold logic of survival held him in place. A wrong move now would cost Gracie her life. "I'm coming up," he called, meeting Bellingham's eyes with a silent message. "Be ready." As Dillon climbed the ladder, he kept his movements deliberately slow and his hands visible. Emerging into the main room, he found Gracie held at gunpoint by a bearded man whose cruel eyes suggested he wouldn't hesitate to carry out his threat. "That's far enough," the man ordered. "Hands where I can see them." "You too, Bellingham," he added as James emerged from the cellar behind Dillon. "Thought you could steal our payday, did you?" "The cattle were never yours to begin with, Reeves," Bellingham replied evenly. "Neither was I." The man Reeves laughed humorlessly. "Tell that to Marlowe." "Oh wait, you can't, because he's either dead or in jail thanks to your sister's new friends." He pressed the gun harder against Gracie's temple, making her wince. "Speaking of which, who are you?" he demanded of Dillon. "Just a hired gun," Dillon replied, keeping his voice neutral while his mind raced through possible scenarios. Harris would have seen the situation through the cabin's windows, but a shot from outside was too risky with Gracie held so close. "Well, hired gun, you picked the wrong job." Reeves gestured toward the door with his free hand. "Outside, both of you. My boys will be back any minute, and then we'll decide what to do with all of you." It happened in an instant, a flash of movement as Gracie suddenly drove her elbow backward into Reeves' stomach with surprising force. The man's grip loosened just enough for her to duck away, creating the opening Dillon had been waiting for. He lunged forward, tackling Reeves before the man could recover or aim his weapon. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, the gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as they struggled. Bellingham immediately joined the fray, helping to subdue the larger man despite his weakened condition. By the time Harris burst through the door, rifle ready, Reeves lay unconscious and bound with his own belt. "The others?" Dillon asked urgently. "Deputies have them pinned down by the cattle pen," Harris reported. "2 down, 3 surrendered, 1 trying to escape on horseback but won't get far." It was over. The relief that flooded through Dillon left him momentarily lightheaded as he turned to check on Gracie, who stood trembling but unbowed beside her brother. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, crossing to her in 2 quick strides. "No," she assured him, though the red mark on her temple where the gun had pressed suggested she'd have a bruise to match the one on her cheek. "I'm fine, thanks to your lessons." Dillon blinked in confusion. "My lessons?" A faint smile touched her lips despite the tension still evident in her posture. "You told me once that on the frontier you use any advantage that presents itself." When he focused on you and James, he loosened his grip just enough. Pride in something deeper surged through Dillon at her resourcefulness. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as though to reassure himself that she was truly unharmed. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he murmured against her hair. She relaxed into his embrace for just a moment before pulling back, her attention turning to her brother who watched them with undisguised interest. "James," she said, moving to hug him carefully, mindful of his injuries, "I've been so worried." Bellingham returned her embrace somewhat awkwardly, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion. "Gracie, what are you doing in Montana? Your letter said nothing about coming west, and then Marlowe showed up claiming you'd arrived and he'd take care of you if I didn't pay what he thought I owed." "It's a long story," she sighed. "One better told somewhere warm and safe." With the immediate danger past, they set about securing the remaining captives and recovering the stolen cattle. The deputies would escort the prisoners to Helena, while Harris helped drive the cattle back to Bellingham's ranch. Dillon, Gracie, and James would ride directly to the Jackson Ranch, where James could recover from his ordeal while plans were made for the future. As they prepared to depart the next morning, Dillon found himself the recipient of James Bellingham's scrutiny as they saddled their horses. "My sister seems to trust you implicitly, Sutherland," Bellingham remarked casually. "That's not something Gracie does easily, especially not with men after what happened in St. Louis." Dillon paused in adjusting Belle's saddle. "She told you about Hammond." "Enough." Bellingham's expression hardened momentarily before softening into something like grudging respect. "She also told me how you found her during the blizzard, how you've helped her these past weeks. And how you insisted on coming after me, even when the marshal thought it hopeless." "Anyone would have." "No," Bellingham interrupted, "they wouldn't have. Believe me, I've seen enough of humanity's worst to recognize its best when I encounter it." He extended his hand. "Thank you for protecting my sister when I couldn't." Dillon accepted the handshake, uncomfortable with the gratitude but understanding its importance to the other man. She protected herself more than once, he felt compelled to point out. "She's stronger than you might remember." A smile touched Bellingham's face, the same smile Gracie sometimes wore when amused. "Oh, I've never doubted Gracie's strength, just her judgment, occasionally." His gaze sharpened. "Though in this case, I think her judgment may have been uncommonly sound." Before Dillon could respond to the implied approval, Gracie joined them, and the moment for further conversation passed. But as they rode south toward the Jackson Ranch, Dillon found himself contemplating a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine, one that included more than solitary survival. They reached the ranch late on the second day, greeted with relief and celebration by the Jacksons and the other hands. Mrs. Jackson immediately took charge of James Bellingham's care, clucking over his injuries and insisting on preparing special broths and poultices that she claimed would speed his recovery. In the days that followed, as James regained his strength and plans were made for the return to his homestead, Dillon found himself increasingly aware of the impending separation. Gracie would naturally accompany her brother home once he was able to travel, their reconciliation having been complete and heartfelt after the danger had passed. The thought of her departure created an ache in Dillon's chest that no amount of busy work could dispel. He took on the most demanding tasks around the ranch, pushing himself physically as though the exhaustion might somehow prepare him for the emptiness her absence would create. One evening, a week after their return, Dillon stood outside the barn watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of it struck him anew, as though seeing it through Gracie's eyes had somehow restored his capacity for wonder. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" Her voice behind him nearly made him jump, so lost had he been in contemplation. "Yes," he agreed simply, turning to find her wrapped in a heavy shawl against the evening chill, her golden hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd rarely seen. The sight made his heart constrict painfully. "I used to dream of such views," she continued, moving to stand beside him. "St. Louis has its own beauty, but nothing like this expanse of sky and mountain." She glanced at him. "I understand now why you love it, despite the hardships." "When do you leave?" Dillon asked abruptly, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer. "James thinks we can travel in another week, assuming the weather holds." She hesitated. "He's offered me a permanent home with him. Says the cabin needs a woman's touch, and he could use help with the household while he rebuilds his herd." Dillon nodded, unsurprised but still pained by the confirmation. "It's a good arrangement," he forced himself to say. "You'll be with family, safe." "Safe," she repeated as though testing the word. "Yes, I suppose that's true, though safety seems a strange concept after everything we've experienced." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, filled with all the things Dillon wanted to say but couldn't find words for. How could he ask her to consider a different future when he had nothing concrete to offer? A drifting cowhand with no land, no home beyond the bunkhouses that sheltered him between seasons. What right did he have to seek more from a woman like Gracie? "James asked me an interesting question yesterday," she said finally, her voice careful, measured. "He asked if I was certain about going with him to Elkhorn Creek." Dillon glanced at her sharply. "You're not." "I'm not sure what I want anymore," she admitted, meeting his gaze directly. 3 months ago, my only thought was escaping a disastrous engagement and finding my brother. Now," she gestured vaguely at the landscape around them, "now I've discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. I've survived challenges I never imagined facing. I've found a place where, despite the dangers, I feel more alive than I ever did in St. Louis." Hope flickered dangerously in Dillon's chest, a fragile flame he dared not nurture. "The Jackson Ranch has become home to you." "Not exactly." She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the way the fading light gilded her features. "It's not the place, Dillon, it's the people. One person in particular." The directness of her statement, its unmistakable meaning, left him momentarily speechless. When he'd finally gathered his scattered thoughts, all he could manage was a hoarse, "Gracie, I have nothing to offer you." "Nothing?" she challenged softly. "No home, perhaps, no settled future, certainly. But what of the man who crashed through a window to protect me, who tracked my brother through a wilderness that would terrify most? Who looks at me not as something fragile to be sheltered, but as someone worth standing beside?" Her words stripped away his remaining defenses, laying bare the truth he'd been fighting since the moment he found her in that snowstorm. That she had become essential to him, as necessary as breath. "I've spent years believing the frontier allows no room for attachment," he said, the admission torn from somewhere deep within. That caring for others was a luxury that only invited heartbreak. He reached out cautiously, taking her hand in his. "Then you appeared in the middle of a blizzard and challenged everything I thought I knew." Gracie's fingers tightened around his, warm despite the evening chill. "And what do you know now?" "That I love you," Dillon said simply, the words easier than he'd expected once he surrendered to their truth. "That the thought of you leaving with your brother feels like losing a part of myself. That I want to build something with you, Gracie Bellingham, even though I'm not entirely sure what that something is or where it might lead." Joy bloomed across her face, transforming it in the fading light. "That's the most beautiful declaration I've ever heard, Dillon Sutherland, far more honest than any practiced speech from a St. Louis gentleman." Before he could respond, she closed the remaining distance between them and kissed him, a gentle press of lips that conveyed more clearly than words her answer to his unspoken question. Dillon's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened into something that promised a future neither had dared imagine until this moment. When they finally parted, breathless in the gathering twilight, Dillon pressed his forehead against hers. "Your brother might have something to say about this development," he murmured. Gracie laughed, the sound like music in the stillness. James has already said it. He told me yesterday that if I chose to stay, he would understand. That he saw the way we look at each other and recognizes something worth building. Her expression turned more serious. He also offered you a job should you want it, said he could use a partner with your skills and integrity once his ranch is running properly again. The unexpected offer stunned Dillon. A partnership with a man who barely knows me. A man who trusts his sister's judgment, Gracie corrected gently, and who has seen your character tested under the most extreme circumstances. She touched his cheek. But that's a decision for another day. Tonight, I only need to know one thing. Do you want me to stay? More than I've ever wanted anything, Dillon admitted, the words coming easier now that the first barrier had fallen. Snow began to fall around them, soft flakes that drifted in the still air like nature's blessing on their newfound understanding. Dillon took Gracie's hand in his, overwhelmed by the possibilities suddenly stretching before them. It won't be easy, he warned, echoing his words from what seemed a lifetime ago in Helena. The frontier demands much from those who choose it. But we'll face it together, Gracie replied, snow gathering in her golden hair like a crown of stars. Because alone we would perish. Dillon smiled, recognizing her repetition of the wisdom that had first opened his eyes to the possibility of a different kind of frontier life, one where strength came not from isolation, but from the bonds between people who chose to face hardship side by side. He drew her close as the snow continued to fall, enveloping them in a private world of white. Taking her hand in his, he raised it gently to his lips in a gesture that spoke of promise and protection. "Let me be your shelter, Gracie Bellingham," he whispered, his voice carrying in the perfect stillness of the winter evening, "and you be mine." Her answer was in her eyes, bright with unshed tears of joy, and in the way she pressed herself closer to his heart, the heart she had awakened from its long, defensive slumber. Together they stood as the snow continued to fall, two souls who had found in each other the home they had each been seeking without knowing it, a shelter stronger than cabin walls, more enduring than the harshest winter, built of something the frontier could never take away. Love that had been tested by fire and ice and emerged unbroken.